Hello everyone, today I will be presenting on verbal conflicts in siblings. So to begin, it is important to define conflict. Conflict is opposition between two individuals, but in the sibling relationship, it is so much more than that. Managing conflict is the defining feature of sibling relationships and is important for building on the relationship for the future. Now, conflict is most prevalent in early adolescence between ages 13 to 18. And also the proximity of age relates to the frequency of conflict. So especially siblings that are within 2 years of age, they experience the most frequency of conflict. So that helps me to address my gap given that introduction. Most of the research in this area does not cover adolescents. It mostly covers toddlers and full-grown adolescents. Also, I will only be covering verbal conflict. Many of the other studies in this area cover physical conflict. Also, I will be taking a proximity of age that is very tight, ages 14 to 18, to help get that highest frequency of conflict. And also, I will be studying participants of the same gender, particular male, and that is also another thing found in studies, is that male siblings have the most frequency of conflict, and this conflict is the most aggressive. Now, why is this important to you? About 25% of people experience sibling estrangement, meaning that after a period of time, there's no longer any communication between the siblings, and they have no communication and they're detached. So I'm gonna help determine if verbal conflict is good to engage in the early adolescent stage to help prevent sibling estrangement. This research will help to guide sibling relationships, as it'll help to determine specific conflict strategies to participate in, as well if it's good to involve in verbal versus physical conflict. This study is also very important to me, as I have a sibling and he is 2 years younger than me, so I fit also right in that participant range of having a close proximity in age and same gender. So this research is also going to be very impactful for my life moving forward. So all this information leads me to my research question. Can verbal conflict be assessed as either constructive or destructive within the context of sibling relationships among male high school siblings? So verbal conflict can fall under two different categories: constructive conflict and destructive conflict. Constructive conflict is good for relationship quality, as it is a good, healthy conflict to involve in, and it will impact the relationship in a positive way. The goal of constructive conflict is to reduce differences. As mentioned earlier, conflict is a disagreement between two individuals. Constructive conflict is when this difference is resolved and the conflict leads to a positive relationship. Constructive conflict is linked to negotiation tactics, such as reasoning, and it is not linked to things like manipulation or coercion, which is more destructive. The second category of verbal conflict is destructive conflict. Destructive conflict overall leads to a very negative relationship quality, and it provides a negative outcome. Destructive conflict is something that siblings do not want to be involved in, and unfortunately this is the thing that leads to sibling estrangement throughout the world. Some strategies associated with destructive conflict are manipulation and coercion, both of which lead to negative relationship quality. So now, this leads us to verbal conflict, which is the overall umbrella term in which constructive and destructive fall into. It's reasoning versus manipulation. That's why I'm doing this study. How can I determine if verbal conflict is overall good with reasoning, or is it bad with things like manipulation? Verbal conflict overall works to reduce differences and opposed to physical conflict. Verbal conflict, I will measure it as constructive or destructive based on the voluntary time spent together after the conflict. I'll go more into depth this during my method, but if siblings spend time together, quality time together within the same day of the conflict happening, then it'll be categorized as constructive. So this leads us to our data collection. My data collection took place from January to late February. I had the original goal of 12 participants, but I narrowed it down to 6 so I could get the most quality research. I collected from ages 14 to 18 in order to nail that proximity of age and the adolescent factors that lead to more conflict. I also obtained a consent form for each participant, as that was important because many of them were under the age of 18 and also needed a parental signature on that. As shown on the graph, I was able to nail that proximity of age, and also was able to get an average age of around 16, which is perfectly for the early adolescent structure. Now this leads me to my method. I chose a qualitative study because I believe I can't fully understand the sibling relationship just through numbers. I need to really ask them about the relationship in order to understand its background and every conflict that they engage in. This is why I chose a semi-structured interview. With an interview, I believe I can really understand the background of this conflict, why it happens, and if it's overall constructive or destructive. I also chose a semi-structured instead of just a structured because the semi-structured gives me room to really dive into each specific relationship, as not all relationships are the same. As mentioned earlier, the success of each conflict will be measured in the voluntary time that the students spend together. And it'll be determined constructive if they spend that time together within the same day. After I've conducted the interviews and I have a transcription, I will run it through an AI transcriptor, and then I performed an inductive coding process. This process led me to my findings, and it also led me to find the 3 narratives within my data. First of all, to directly answer my research question was to figure out if constructive or destructive. Many of the students found that their conflict was constructive. They spent time with it within the same day, even though many of them right away distanced themselves, but they'd later come back, forgive each other, and move on. There's also many conflict strategies found within this data, but there was 2 main conflict strategies found, which I will touch on later. Also, there was a deep perception on verbal conflict as being good, overall better than physical conflict in that it can build character and it helps the relationship build. So overall, I was able to find that verbal conflict was overall constructive. 5 out of 6 participants said that the spent time together within the same day, meaning that it was constructive. There was 2 main conflict strategies used that were very interesting. One of the main conflict strategies used was parental intervention. Given that these students are both early adolescents between the age of 14 and 18, they still have many of them have a very strong parental figure in their life. So immediately when conflict arises, they go to that parent as they are the authority in the situation. Another conflict strategy used was immediate distancing. They would immediately distance themselves after the conflict, being mad or upset, but then they would come back and spend time together on things that they found in common. This is an easy way, and was touched on in a few of my studies, that they would participate in things that they like and have in common. Another thing is participants viewed verbal conflict as positive. They saw it as a learning opportunity and ability to build character, as opposed to they viewed physical conflict as very aggressive, violent, and destructive. So as mentioned, verbal conflict was just constructive for all 6 siblings. That answers my research question, but does, and also goes along with my hypothesis that it would be constructive. Parental intervention, being a conflict strategy used in the siblings, is very common, and it goes along with many of the research that I found. Furthermore, verbal conflict is better than physical conflict. Verbal conflict, as found in my study, is constructive, while physical conflict is more destructive, even though there's some parts of it that are constructive, but overall verbal conflict is better and is what siblings should engage in. Now, some limitations of my study that I found, one of the limitations was that all of my participants were from the same school, and my school has a Catholic religious background. So brought up these siblings are taught in a religious standpoint, which leads them to engage in a little bit more constructive conflict. They know how to talk through their conflict, and because of that, they might have a better relationship with their sibling. Another thing is recall and response bias. With these biases both arise because of the interview process that I chose. Recall, in my interview, I asked students to recall a specific conflict they had in the last few days. Now, since this conflict has already been resolved, they can recall this conflict as being a little bit more positive than what it actually was. Furthermore, there's response bias. They might answer with the socially acceptable answer. So if they really had a nasty conflict where they got in a fight with their sibling, they might, exaggerate a little bit to make it seem like it was a better conflict and they have a much better relationship with their sibling than they actually do. So why again is this important, and what should you guys be taking away from this? Verbal conflict is constructive in nature. You should be engaging in verbal conflict over physical conflict, as it is more constructive in the early adolescence, which is our age range. Furthermore, this has implications for both siblings and parents. Siblings, you can engage in verbal conflict, and parents shouldn't be hesitant to step in to solve an argument. Parental intervention proved to be constructive in my study, so that can be constructive for many sibling relationships around the world. Furthermore, conflict can be seen as an opportunity to grow. Conflict in its definition is a disagreement. However, in the sibling relationship, it builds and melds the sibling relationship, which is the most important relationship that many people will ever experience. Furthermore, sibling conflict is especially important because as the most important thing in life, you want to have this relationship to extend into college, into your adulthood, and that is only possible if you can manage verbal conflict in a good way. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. I got a few questions for you, and then we'll wrap this up. So for the first one, how did your initial exploration of the scholarly conversation, how did that lead directly to the way you phrased your research question?
For sure. So immediately I wanted to study more of the conflict strategies and how that impacts the sibling relationship. Like if you're going to engage, there's many strategies used, but which ones are the most effective for a positive relationship quality? However, going into the scholarly material, there was already so much of that and I couldn't find a gap. However, I realized that most of this conflict was focused on just physical, so I took the verbal side of it and then also decided to take the early adolescence.
Okay, good. And then as a follow-up to that, how did the limitations of your method or the data at the end, how did that influence your new understandings, maybe its implications?
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the things, I've never done an interview process before, so I think I did the interview without having that bias in mind of the recall and response bias. But now knowing that those biases can really skew my research, and I don't think it's realistic that all 6 students had constructive conflict. So I think those biases could have impacted it in a small way. So I think that's something I would definitely change and maybe do a longer interview or do multiple interviews.
Okay, terrific. And then the final question, what was the most important research skill you developed as part of working on this project this year? And what other things do you think you could apply that skill to?
I think definitely just interviewing people. I think that was so important because I've never done that before. So having that face-to-face interaction, asking them questions, prying more into something sensitive like a sibling relationship. I think that was so important. That'll lead further into life with my career where I'll have to interview people or be interviewed. And I think that's a skill that will go with me for the rest of my life.